An Ontario court recently ruled that the policing powers of the Ontario Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals are unconstitutional. It gave the province 1 year to rewrite the framework for how to enforce laws that protect animals from abuse and neglect. Joining us now for more, Brian Schiller. He's General Counsel for the Ontario SPCA. Kendra Coulter, Chancellor's Chair for Research Excellence and Chair of the Labour Studies Department at Brock University. Akash Maharaj, Chair of the University of Guelph's new Equine Public Policy Group and CEO of the think tank the Mosaic Institute. And Camille Labchuk, Executive Director for the animal rights group Animal Justice. In 1919, 100 years ago, the Ontario government gave the Ontario SPCA, a private charity, law enforcement powers for animal welfare cases. A guy named Jeffrey Bogarts, a paralegal in Eastern Ontario, brought the Attorney General of Ontario to court saying it was unconstitutional for the government to give the OSPCA those powers. The court heard arguments last year. Camille's group, Animal Justice, intervened in the case. The judge ruled on January 2nd, 2019, just earlier this month, and created a new principle of justice, that law enforcement agencies must be transparent and accountable. And the judge said that the OSPCA, as a private charity, was not transparent or accountable to the public, so their law enforcement powers, the judge said, are unconstitutional. And the judge suspended the implementation of the ruling for 1 year so the province could reform animal welfare enforcement, unless, of course, the government appeals, and we're still waiting to find out about that. Camille, why did your group intervene?
Well, we're looking at this as Ontario animal welfare being in crisis. And we saw this as a case where animal issues were going to be at the heart of the case, but nobody there was speaking on behalf of the animals. So you have Mr. Bogarts, who is concerned about property rights of his and other landowners in his community. We should say, he's the Ontario Landowners Association. This is a kind of a rural Eastern Ontario, sort of quasi-libertarian group. I would say very libertarian.
Okay.
That's right. And they're concerned about their own rights. The Ministry of the Attorney General is trying to uphold the law because they want to enforce the status quo and the system that's in place. And Animal Justice felt like we had to be in the court to make sure the judge heard what was best for animals. And for us, transparency and accountability are good for animals when it comes to our law enforcement systems.
Why did you feel those two things were lacking in the way the OSPCA did its business?
Well, the OSPCA is the only private charity in the province that's allowed to enforce publicly enacted laws. And this is something that exists in many places across the country and, in fact, around the Commonwealth. The whole system originates back in the 1800s in the UK when the very first cruelty laws were enacted. Everything was a private prosecution at that point. So it wasn't like there was a public police force that would be doing these cases for animals. So the RSPCA sprung up, and that model spread to the Commonwealth. But we think if you had Royal SPCA in the UK, but we think if you had to design the system from scratch today, like all of our other public law enforcement, it would make more sense to do that.
And what did you think of the court ruling?
Well, the judge actually adopted most of what Animal Justice requested. The judge upheld the OSPCA's search powers, so he said that it's appropriate for them to go and do what they need to do to police animal protection in this province. But he said that the system where a private charity without any accountability, so oversight by police services legislation, for instance, and transparency, so ability to access information, like freedom of information requests, he said that was the problem, and we agreed with that.
Akash, what was your take on the ruling?
I thought it was a great victory for the democratic process for animal welfare and indeed for the OSPCA itself. I should begin by saying that in my work, I have high regard for the OSPCA and especially for the people who are involved in it. I think they are generally well-intentioned and motivated by a desire to protect animal well-being. Having said that, structurally, the OSPCA is an affront to democratic norms. It's an organization that wields public power and consumes public resources, but is not subject to public accountability. It has police powers, including, under certain circumstances, the right to search private property and seize private assets, but it is not subject to the Police Services Act. It is not subject to the Freedom of Information request. It is not subject to oversight or the rulings by the Ombudsman. If you're going to wield that sort of public power, which I think they should, you must be publicly accountable.
Madam Chair, how did you get to this issue?
Well, it's a really significant time to be thinking about, the well-being of animals, but also the people on the front lines who do this work. So this is the only kind of law enforcement where it's a majority women, for example. And we actually have slightly more fair inspectors in the TTC than there are animal cruelty investigators for the entire province of Ontario.
What do you think that says?
I think it says this is a really important issue and that action is needed.
Can you tell us basically what the Ontario SPCA's range of activities are?
Sure. So the OSPCA, part of its responsibilities relate to enforcement of the OSPCA Act. So that deals with the protection of animals, and there are agents and inspectors who lay charges under both the Criminal Code and the OSPCA Act. And
How many?
how many charges?
Inspectors.
Oh, inspectors. I don't know the precise number right now.
About 65.
I was
About
going to say, it's
65.
precious few for a province of 13 million people.
It is precious few. It is inadequately resourced. But remember that I think being lost in the discussion is that the OSPCA, approximately 75% of its work is in other areas related to sheltering, education, spay and neuter. There are a lot of other activities that are done by employees of the OSPCA who are not agents or inspectors. Having said that, the work of those agents and inspectors is very important, and I agree with Kendra that it's time that there is a very serious discussion within government about whether they want to seriously protect animals in this province, animals who have no voice, animals who day in and day out, we know stories of abuse and neglect, and do they not want to adequately protect them?
Do you think the OSPCA was doing its job well?
I think the OSPCA does the best it can under the circumstances, but it frankly has been set up to fail. We have, of course, the structure, which is a problem, so a private charity enforcing public laws. But let's get into the funding for a minute. The OSPCA receives just under $6 million to enforce laws in the entire province of Ontario. And
From the government of Ontario.
That's right. And that only came into place in the last 2 years. Prior to that, they self-funded everything. To put that in context, we spend about $4.4 billion on policing in this province. So you compare that to the $6 million that we devote exclusively to animals, and it is just, frankly, Steve, a joke.
I've heard on a CBC report that the OSPCA isn't even going onto people's farms and doing investigations into allegations of cruelty against horses because of the controversy we're talking about right now. Can you help us out with that at all?
I think this discussion is really illuminating. It highlights a couple major problems with our animal welfare system. So there's the issue of enforcement in the first place. Right now, enforcement of laws on farms is complaint-based. That's because we don't have proactive inspections. And the reason we don't have proactive regular inspections of farms is because there are no laws. There's no standards, no regulations governing the lives of animals on farms from the minute that they're born to the day that they're shipped for transport. So for the OSPCA to even have an ability to go on those farms depends on members of the public or a worker perhaps complaining. And that happens so rarely. And it really demonstrates, I think, why this system is a problem. Animals are kept behind closed doors. They can't report abuse themselves. And there's nobody there actively looking for that abuse.
Do you expect the Ontario government to spend more money to resource all of the things we've been talking about here?
Let's also keep in mind that this is a government that believes in law and order. This is a government that wants effective law enforcement. This is about animals, and there's broad-based support for animal protections. I mean, I'm conducting a public survey right now, stopanimalcruelty.ca, gauging the views of the public on this issue. The numbers are exceeding my wildest expectations because people feel very passionately about this issue.
He has already devoted $25 million over 4 years to combating gun violence. And so I think that bodes well for the idea of supporting animals. Animal protection support cuts across party lines. It's not a right-wing issue. It's not a left-wing issue. When you poll people consistently, over 90% that they say that they want stronger animal cruelty laws and better enforcement. And I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that of the $4.4 billion devoted to policing in this province, that we maybe put $100 million towards the animals.
An appeal may be heard sometime later this year. Where that takes us is a whole other thing. But the government has some decisions to make regardless of the appeal with a contract that expires at the end of March of this year.
Camille, if it appears they are now appealing the decision, are you back in court then?
We'll absolutely be back in court, making sure that the animals' interests are first and forefront at the Court of Appeal hearing. I expect there will be other interveners too. And this is obviously something that's going to be decided by a higher court. This idea of a principle of fundamental justice is not something that courts take lightly. It's a very big deal to introduce a new one, as was done in this case. So a higher court will review that. But more broadly, this is a point of departure from public discussion, and that's already happening both in Ontario and across the country. As Kendra mentioned, the Edmonton Humane Society has backed away from doing enforcement. Manitoba already has a different model. Newfoundland has a different model. This conversation is starting to happen, and I think that all Ontarians should be engaged in it. So we're encouraging, through animal justice, citizens to contact their members of provincial parliament and make sure that their views are known on this, because this issue is something politicians need to hear from us on.